YouTube. Hello for anyone who is joining me right away here. I'm going to see who you are in a second as the computer catches up with us. Hope you guys are well today. And let me see if it's going to come up here for me. Okay. Yeah, there we are. Okay. Excellent. Excellent. Hope you're joining me. See what happens. People shuffle in. Go ahead and say hi here in the chat if you are watching. And I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. So welcome. This is Don't Let It Go, my Wednesday show that I do solo. Sometimes I'm going to be having interviews here. And in fact, I do have one awesome, exciting announcement, which is that next week at this time, I have the honor of getting to have a discussion with John Allison, the former CEO of BB&T. He has agreed to talk with me, not obviously in person, because none of us are speaking in person practically these days, unless you're quarantining with somebody. But instead, we are going to be speaking over Zoom, which is what everybody's doing these days. So John Allison will be joining me, and I'm going to, of course, be interested to hear his perspective generally on this crazy time that we're in. But in particular, the idea that I had was that now that we're looking at opening things up, opening businesses, what would he do as a CEO of, a bank or any other sort of business today to ensure that we could go ahead and get going and be productive again in this country, but at the same time be sensible about the coronavirus. And in fact, here I am, because today's title for the show today is Coronavirus False Alternatives. And of course, one of the false alternatives that we're going to be looking at, or that we could look at today, is opening up for business or still trying to stop the spread of this virus. Those are false alternatives, right? You can try to do both. Now, can you perfectly stop the spread of the virus? No, I think the only way to perfectly stop the spread of the virus is to kill all the potential hosts of the virus, which is nothing that anybody is going to advocate these days, right? So, if you have somebody like a Fauci going up and saying, hey, if you want to perfectly 100% stop the spread of this virus, then nobody leaves their house for a month. Everybody stays in their house for a month, and then somehow you're going to perfectly. No, we're not doing that, right? So given that we're not going to do that, how is it that you can, within the realistic, consistent with taking the human species into a future that doesn't portend total disaster, how can you balance, right, going back to work and still being sensible about preventing the spread of a virus for which we still don't know everything in terms of treatments? There's still more news about the different potential treatments out there and whether they're effective or not. We don't know about that. We don't have a vaccine yet. And without a vaccine, the experts are telling us, and I believe, that you cannot have herd immunity. We still don't know how much damage this virus is doing. They're still learning about that. Nonetheless, we have to get back to work. So how can you do both sensibly? I'm really looking forward to speaking with John Allison about that. And the other thing was yesterday, I'm doing better today, but yesterday I was in kind of a funk. And you know how you do during this time period, you maybe immerse yourself in too much news, and then you start thinking about both the effects of the virus and the effects of the economic measures that our out of control leaders are taking right now. And between the both, you can start to portend a not so great future. And I've always found John Allison to be both grounded in reality, but then also a wonderful optimistic presence. And so I'm looking forward to that in terms of spiritual fuel as well. So I hope that you will join me next week. But yes, here today it's solo. And what do I have in store with you? I have some discussion of a few false alternatives, and this was inspired by the logic class that I'm currently teaching. Those of you who have been following me noted that I had offered a special discount on to my supporters and patrons and subscribers, but also offered the class generally. I'm doing an intro logic class that I've been teaching online. This is something that I had thought of doing for quite a long time, and then took this opportunity while working at home all the time during this coronavirus era to go ahead and launch that and see how it goes. And so far, I'm having a really good time with it. One of the purposes for me has been to re-immerse myself in the material just for myself. And if you followed me for a very long time, you know that back in the Obama era, what I used to like to do was to shred Obama's speeches, and I would identify different fallacies and other sorts of thinking errors and just dissect those speeches. And I would do it on my shows that were on Blog Talk Radio. And sometimes I would post blog posts about that as well. And in fact, one of the blog posts that I posted about an Obama speech ended up being included in some sort of online delivered intro logic course. It actually is material that has been assigned to students all over the world because of that. So, I mean, I know this is a useful exercise. So today, the things that we're going to talk about, it's been inspired by my recent re-immersion in this material, because this material, particularly the informal fallacies, and also, as I've told my students, Mill's methods, when you talk about Mill's methods for proper inductive reasoning, those have just been indispensable for me throughout my life ever since I've been exposed to them. And of course, I've been exposed to them thanks to Leonard Peikoff had an intro logic course way back when. And then I started teaching intro logic myself. In fact, in 2001, I was getting paid to teach my first intro logic course. That time when 9/11 came around, I was teaching at Mount St. Mary's up in Los Angeles. So, quite interesting to come and revisit this again during the era of coronavirus, right? But no, it's been great. And as I said, false alternatives is what's been on my mind. And so we're going to talk about a few of those today. One of them was inspired by a Twitter debate that I'm having out there with somebody. So we'll get into all of that. And then the other thing I want to try today with you, which I have not tried on this show before, so you're going to have to be kind with me because I haven't tried. I think I know how to do it, which is I'm going to try to share my screen with you. And I'm not going to completely go through a Trump speech, but I looked at some of the briefing from yesterday that Trump and the different task force people gave and stuff. And I wanted to get a little segment of that from München, and maybe we'll play little bits and I'll dissect some of that for you because I saw some interesting tidbits in there. And mostly I just want to play with this new toy that I have learned. How did I learn about this toy? What finally made me try to get this skill? It was my interview with Tamir Hendelman last week. And actually, he's the one who demonstrated how easy the share screen function on Zoom actually is to use. It's fairly merciful. And, you don't have to have like a completely beautiful to look at desktop or anything to share what you want to share. So I'm going to go ahead and try it. So be gentle with me when I do that, but I think that's going to be a lot of fun as well. And in doing that, in us kind of going through the Munchen part of the briefing there, then we are going to be rejecting one of the false alternatives that I talk about. Okay, so we're going to do that in such a way. It's going to be a lot of fun. Okay, so thank you for joining me. If you are here and wanting to be supportive of my show, I much appreciate clicking like over there on YouTube. If you're joining me live right now, I'm looking for those likes. Go ahead and click like. I know in order to click like or come in and participate in the chat, you actually have to log into YouTube, but it is much appreciated all of your participation as well. One of the toys that I am hoping to get in the very near future here is, besides the share screen, which I want to make use of and maybe start really shredding those Trump speeches when I get the stomach for it. Another toy that I want is Super Chat, which I can only get when I get to monetization, and I can only get to monetization when I get more viewing time. I am over 3/4 of the way towards an adequate number of viewing hours on YouTube. So I'm getting there. The way you can help is that if you want to help me get there, if you do like a particular show, share that show with your friends. Every bit of exposure so that I get new people viewing, checking out the material on my channel, that is going to help me. So those of you who have been doing it, I really appreciate it. And again, I'm also trying to bring interviews with people whom I value, and hopefully you will come to value for various things, sometimes objectivist, sometimes not. But it doesn't matter, right? These are people who I think have real value to offer the world. If you have not checked out the interview last week that we did with Tamir Hendelman on Friday, I highly recommend it. Tamir is one of the top jazz pianists in the entire world, and I was super lucky that he gave me some of his time last week. And when you watch the interview, you will see why. He is the sort of, of the form, the platonic form of warmth and equanimity, if you could have a platonic form of both of those combined. And if you check that interview out, you'll see not only that, he plays a couple clips, and that's what he did. He shared the screen here on YouTube. He shared some of his video, so you get to actually see him in action, and he gave introductions to each of the pieces, giving you a little bit of background behind each of the clips and everything. It was wonderful. And then if you like that, it's again, it's free for you to watch this interview with me and him here on YouTube last Friday. Check it out on my channel. If you like what you see, then you can also sign up to watch live the series of live at home concerts that he's been doing. He did one last Friday and I watched it. I loved it. I already got my ticket for this Saturday. He's got one this Friday. This Saturday. He's calling them Tamir Hendelman at Home. And I think it's just Tamir at Home. He does it. He's not pretentious, right? Tamir at Home. But it's a really nice series, and he does it on Zoom, and he's becoming a Zoom master. And he told me, I was just talking to him yesterday, and he told me that he has now invested in some more equipment so that the lighting and the sound is going to be even better this week than it was last week. So I think you'll love it. Mark over in the chat, he says, I was just about to ask why you didn't have the super chat button. Yeah, I cannot have a super chat button until I reach the requisite number of hours, which I said, as I said, I'm well over 3/4 of the way there. And the way that you can help me is by the likes and the subscribes and the share, all the things that are going to get me more exposure here on YouTube so that I can get those hours up. So I appreciate all of your help in that regard. So we're going to get going on this. False alternatives in the coronavirus COVID era. And I'm covering them in a certain order. Why don't we cover one of them? Because it's just sort of a review of where I've been so far in the past on this issue. And you have seen various versions probably out there on the internet, especially if you're in my bubble. Probably it's been shared more within my bubble than otherwise, but there's been these Venn diagrams with these circles about what it is that you could be concerned about. So the kind of two big ones, of course, are that you are concerned about the coronavirus itself and its spread and the illness, the COVID-19 that it instigates in the host of the virus. So you can be concerned about that, or people say you can be concerned about the effects of a lockdown and all of the financial fallout from the lack of productivity when our governments, whether state, local, whatever, have shut down all but essential businesses. As far as I know, there is not any place in the United States that has gone towards the full lockdown measures that you have seen in some places. We have these sort of limited lockdown measures, and they try to define what's called essential services and go from there. A lot of the false alternatives out there are premised on the idea that if you're concerned about one, you can't be concerned about another. And there are a number of us who have rejected that and said, no, we are concerned about the financial fallout. We are concerned about both, the spread of the virus as well. And there are a number of people like me who have been in favor of a lockdown, but a lockdown for only a limited time period. And, to sort of give you another way of looking at the issue and to explain why, because people say, oh, well, how can you be an objectivist? An objectivist is in favor of a government with only limited functions to protect individual rights. And doesn't everybody have the right to just go out there and determine the risk for himself? And in fact, I believe, there are a number of people in objectivism whom I very much respect who have said, no, I'm just in favor of no lockdowns at all and everybody fend for himself and go out there and you take the risks for yourself, as long as there's no initiation of force, and you don't see that there is in this case. So let me say a couple things in review about this. And one of them is that early on, when we were just going into the whole lockdown issue, we did not know exactly what we were dealing with. And in fact, we still don't know exactly what we're dealing with coronavirus. As far as we know, there is either from the virus itself or the types of treatments that the doctors have scrambled to put together, there can be long-lasting damage to patients. Another source of the long-lasting damage was something that was a subject of a New York Times article just the other day, which is that the way that this particular virus ends up attacking the lungs, it can establish a certain type of very insidious, diffuse, and to the host of the virus, almost indetectable version of pneumonia. So that by the time there are actual detectable symptoms for the patient, the pneumonia has already progressed quite a bit and done quite a lot of damage, right? So these are things that they're still learning about this virus. And yes, young hosts of the virus can get this. Anyway, point being, we didn't know how dangerous it was at the beginning. And you might say that even if we were already living in an ideal political situation, political and economic situation where we had completely free markets in medicine and otherwise, even if we were there, then depending on the type of disease that comes into a country, there might be a certain role for government in an emergency like that, right? If it's an emergency. Ebola would clearly be an emergency. Arguably, maybe at the beginning, coronavirus, when we didn't know more about it, was an emergency. As far as we know right now, it's more like what John Taylor called it, a turbocharged flu. And so probably right now, knowing what we know, going, kind of Monday morning quarterbacking, we'd say, okay, it wasn't really an emergency. And so if we were in our ideal society, then a lockdown wouldn't be justified at all. Okay, so the first issue is, if it's an emergency, if it seems enough of an emergency, we were caught off guard because the Chinese were hiding information about it, all this stuff, right? You say, okay, lockdown maybe for a limited time. Even in a proper society, it might have been appropriate for a short period of time to lock down, to get a handle on what in the world's going on. And then once you get a handle, get all those experts up to speed on it and everything. And then we see, okay, it's a turbocharged flu, stop the lockdown, get going. And probably in that kind of society, you wouldn't require, that you wouldn't have all these businesses going out of business and all sorts of horrible things, because it would be a very short time period. You figure out whether it's an Ebola or a, super fatal respiratory illness, or otherwise it's just like the turbocharged flu, and it's something that the system can handle without mass disaster. Okay. But then we need to think about the fact that we are not in that ideal system. And so let's, just do a thought experiment for a minute with me, okay? Suppose you today said, okay, here's your turbocharged flu, and, it may be really turbocharged, right? We don't know exactly, but suppose you say, okay, we're just going to end the lockdowns completely. Everybody just go do what they want. We're going to give some advisories about it. We have experts telling you, yeah, you should wear the masks, and really you shouldn't be having these big gatherings and stuff, but government's not going to do anything about it, right? Now, ideally, right, what would the poor doctors and nurses who are going to be overloaded, right? And this is something I've talked about in the past. We are not in that ideal scenario. right? We are not in a scenario where our healthcare system has been free from government interference. If our healthcare system had been unburdened by government interference for decades, which is what has been the case, it would not be so atrophied in its ability to respond to this. And so, maybe there wouldn't have been any risk of overburdening the hospitals and them running out of beds and equipment and everything else, because it would be very agile and very able to respond to conditions. It has not been that case, right? So what might happen now, as we're seeing when they're opening in places across the country, if people are reckless, if people decide that they're going to go ahead and go have their big, huge parties on the beaches or wherever else and just spread the thing with wild abandon, in part maybe because, they're mad at people for locking them down, and maybe there has been overbearing authority in some places. Suppose they're irrational and they go out there and they do this, and then they do overburden the hospitals. What would you like for the doctors and potentially the nurses as well to be able to do when one of those spring break, Palm Beach, whatever people come in there? And yes, young people are getting sick on this too. Young people are, winding up in the ICU. It's hard to determine who's immune from this stuff. You require hospital assistance. Imagine you get sick and you've been one of those reckless people. What would you like them to be able to do? You would like them to be able to refuse to provide medical services and say, look, you were responsible for this. You have made it so that I have had to have a huge viral load thrown at me every day. If I make the slightest mistake with my PPE equipment or whatever, I'm susceptible to catch the virus. We've seen doctors and nurses fall victim to this virus, in part because I think of the huge viral load, working all kinds of hours and everything. There could be a tremendous burden put on them, and you would like them to be able to shrug the burden that is put on them by the irrational, stupid people who are going to go out there and spread this virus because they think, oh, my freedom, and I'm going to go do this. Can doctors and nurses do that today? Can hospitals turn away those people who are reckless and irresponsible about the spread of this virus? No, they can't, right? We are not in a free system. And so what you're doing today, in effect, if you're saying we shouldn't have any restrictions, is that you're tinkering in one place. It's like a game of Jenga, okay? And so you're saying, okay, we've got this horrible mixed economy with all these constraints. You overlay on that something that, at least arguably at first, looked to be an emergency. Now it is a non-trivial burden, which is this turbocharged flu with no vaccine that is still a bit unpredictable and is causing a lot of death. You overlay that, and then you say, okay, well, I know that we've got this mixed economy system, but nonetheless, I think that you should just not do anything in terms of government intervention when you overlay this huge risk and burden. And what's going to happen? What's going to happen is disaster, potentially, if you don't prevent the worst things from happening, at least, right? So you could say, okay, we're in the turbocharged flu era. We sort of get it. And probably the risk can be mitigated to a large extent by, say, banning huge gatherings, right? And at least you're going to do that. Why? Because today people are not willing to lift the restrictions, the mandates on hospitals and doctors that they must treat whoever walks in the damn door. That's the burden on them right now. It's mandatory. And it's mandatory if they don't have any insurance, and it's mandatory if they are reckless people who have purposefully decided that they want to spread it. And maybe they're purposefully trying to spread it in the name of, quote, creating herd immunity, which I understand actually can't be done without a vaccine. Whatever reason it is, you would like the doctors and the hospitals to be able to do this. They can't. They're forced to treat whoever walks in the door. And you can't say, okay, we want to keep that, or we know that that's going to be kept, right? Because a lot of people that I would talk to, they say, no, I'm in favor of getting rid of that. But for right now, I'm in favor of getting rid of this other restriction. We can't do that, right? Just like with Social Security, many of us who are in favor of eliminating Social Security and other social welfare programs, we don't think it's a proper function of government, we would nonetheless not drop the entire program tomorrow, right? It's not going to be done all in one day. Why? Because if you do that, then just hell breaks loose. And in fact, you've been unjust to people who have paid into the system their whole life and are now left in the lurch, right? That's my view. And so why would you say, okay, we're just going to have no restrictions, no lockdowns at all, and then put all the burden on the doctors and nurses and everybody else, simply because you've played Jenga with this huge mixed economy system that has made it so that we cannot respond in the ideal way. The ideal way would be you'd have an agile healthcare system and you'd have the freedom of those who work in the healthcare system to refuse to provide service. I know that meme's been going around there. It's like, the person who's going to be reckless, they sign the waiver or whatever. That's a joke. That is a joke, people. You can't do that today. And actually, ideally, you would want the poor people who are going to be subjected to the increased viral and psychological load from reckless people spreading the disease, you would want them to be able to have legal recourse. They do not today. Okay, that's not the system that we're in. So given that we have the system that we are in, what is it that you can reasonably advocate for today? I don't think you can advocate for absolutely no lockdown. You can't advocate for absolutely no lockdown. Now, what can you reasonably advocate for? You can reasonably advocate for a very limited time period lockdown where the people in our government do a whole mea culpa, right? You would like to see Trump up there saying, yes, I know that I personally, through trying to court China during this whole trade deal, that I have turned a blind eye a bit to some extent about the risk that this virus presents. And I wanted, of course, to make sure that the deal goes through. And so maybe I was treating it as something that was insignificant early on, but mea culpa, I didn't do enough. And also I know, even though it wasn't completely on my watch, I know that the FDA and other government regulations have stood in the way of our healthcare systems being able to be prepared for this. And so what I'm advising is that we all just kind of hang tight for 2-3 weeks. And I'm going to lift all those restrictions. We're going to make sure that the FDA gets out of the way. And we know that it's our entrepreneurs, our tech people, our people in medical research, our people on the front lines, the doctors figuring out the treatments and stuff. Those are the people who are going to help us get a handle on what we're dealing with. And we will revisit after 2 weeks, whatever it is, and we're going to see exactly what the state is with regard to this. And at that point, we're going to see whether this is actually an emergency and something that requires people being actually locked down versus not, et cetera. You know, ultimately, and Trump would go on in my fantasy saying ultimately that you would open up a free market in healthcare, and he realizes that he should never have been in favor of universal healthcare for anybody, because that's the type of thing that has resulted in the atrophy of our healthcare system and the potential for it being overwhelmed because of a turbocharged flu, et cetera, right? He'd do this mea culpa, he would actually get out of the way, et cetera. And you'd have that limited 2-3 weeks. That's what I've been in favor of. That would be something that is more realistic. Again, because you can't play Jenga. You can't play Jenga. The whole thing will collapse in a horrible, ugly, disgusting way. The best you can do is figure out how to deal with what is potentially this limited emergency and get the restrictions off as soon as possible and learn lessons from it, right? One of the lessons that, for instance, Amish Adalja's been putting out there is the need to be prepared for a pandemic. That's one of the lessons. But apparently there was some stuff put in place by George W. Bush, and it was dismantled under Obama, and it hasn't been reinstated under Trump. And so that's one of the reasons we've been caught flat-footed. learn some lessons and don't keep doing what you're doing. And certainly don't, as all the politicians have been doing, don't use this emergency as an excuse to push all your pet programs through and to exert your importance and try to pretend that you are more important than you are. For example, I saw there was a release from someone in the FDA, and there was a drug company or somebody who had come up with a promising treatment or a test. I think it was a test. Maybe it was a test. Testings and treatments are things that the FDA is still holding its grip on to a large extent. And so the FDA was saying, oh, that, we've been working in conjunction with such and such company on a treatment or a test or whatever. And this shows the power of the innovation of private companies working together with the government. And it's not that the government is doing anything. The government is saying, oh, we'll get out of your way and allow you to innovate. And then we're going to pat ourselves on the back and take credit for part of the innovation. The innovation is that we're streamlining our approval process to actually let you do what you would otherwise do on a free market. That's garbage, right? This is the junk that government throws at us and shows that it's not learning its lesson in any way, shape, or form. As I said, I'm not going to play you a Trump clip. I'm going to spare you that today. But on Sunday, I watched the briefing, and he's up there and he's got swabs, so he's comparing one of these nasal swabs that supposedly they're having a hard time producing enough of, and he compares it to a Q-tip. And, this whole thing about, oh, and we've got swabs and there's so many swabs. And let me tell you how many flights we have put out there, delivering PPE equipment and gowns and all these other things and high quality gowns and all that. This is not a government's job, right, to be producing this stuff. The swabs, they're very, I guess, effective visually. It makes for good optics to put these swabs up there and talk about how you're delivering swabs. But it detracts from the main issue as I see it, which is trying to get a handle on what progress we've made towards any herd immunity, how prevalent the infection is out there in the country now. And the only way we can do that is through antibody testing. Antibody testing doesn't involve a swab, so you can wave a swab all day long. He never spoke about antibody testing during the entire press conference, and none of the journalists asked him about it, which I don't know why they don't. Antibody testing is the key, and he's deflecting from it. So I think he's, again, not learning his lesson. How is he also not learning the lesson? He keeps bragging about ventilators. He has strong-armed companies in the United States, which is, again, something that he should not be doing. There should be no strong arming. It should be a government doing a mea culpa and getting out of the way, right? But instead, he has strong-armed companies into retooling so that they can make ventilators. Now, ventilators are like the 6 weeks ago therapy for coronavirus, as far as I understand. The goal right now, as I understand it, again, I'm not an expert, go out there and look and see what the latest and greatest is. But as I've read the articles, the trends seem to be going towards using either antiviral or other types of drug therapies to make sure that the patient never gets to a point of being put on a ventilator. Those being put on a ventilator had a survival rate of about 20%, as far as I know, and there's been damage done to people just by the mere fact of putting them on the ventilator itself. It is not the treatment of choice, as far as I understand, for coronavirus anymore. And every day, even yesterday, he was on again bragging about the damn ventilators. And this is not learning your lesson. This is you thinking that you have to be all important and that you have to be the person who protects and provides and everything. No, no, no. In an emergency, government would have a very limited role in this regard. They would have some role in a true emergency, say an Ebola, whatever. But in terms of collecting experts and directing what experts should do and directing what factories should do and everything else, this is not a war. This is an emergency. This is more like a tornado and stuff, right? So he's not, in this position where he should be commandeering industry to figure out what to do. Another thing that he's doing is he's using this as an excuse to push through infrastructure spending. Heard Munchin talking about that this morning. And also, the other thing was immigration, right? So he's backed off a bit. He's going to have some sort of restriction for 60 days in the name of American jobs. But he has been just looking for an excuse to ban immigration as much as he could, all through his presidency. So here he is, he's using his now I'm not going to just kind of bag only on Trump in this regard. He's the president, so we go to him first. But if you look at the liberal governors of the various states, they have deemed essential versus non-essential in ways that make absolutely no sense, and in fact have often been traced to the pet interests of the governors. Another thing that governors have done is that they've used the whole emergency as an excuse to, for instance, almost, take command of hotels, entire hotels, to house homeless people in the name of preventing the spread of the virus and things like that. These are not proper functions of government, and certainly not to take command of resources for extended periods of time the way that they're doing. Okay. Mark says he saw a Facebook ad from a nurse practitioner in Las Vegas for in-home antibody tests for $120 each. I was tempted, but it looked too scammy. I'm with you, Mark, right? And this is the thing that all of us need to be able to figure out for ourselves what makes sense and what doesn't. And we need to get information, of course, that isn't full of media scare tactics too. So it's hard to figure out with respect to the antibody tests, what is the truth? It seems to me that there is a risk that the antibody tests are not that accurate, and that if you were to pay $120 for each of them, that it might not be worth it, especially for some people. It depends on your value hierarchy. People have been talking about an accuracy rate to these antibody tests of about 85% or something. And I need to review my probability math, my statistics and things. But as I understand it, that statistically works out to you needing to give yourself 2 tests in order to get some accuracy. And exactly how it works out, I don't know. I would have to, as I said, go do the probability math. Maybe you need 3. I'm not exactly sure, but 2 or 3 you'd have to perform in order to get up to the accuracy level that you would want. And so that's the sort of thing you have to think about when you are looking at the various broad-based antibody administrations that they've done in Santa Clara. I believe they've done some, I think, in New York, and I think they've also done some in Los Angeles recently. And oddly enough, I mean, this is where you start to think maybe there is some consensus. Oddly enough, all of those broad-based antibody surveys have come up with, in the Netherlands, they've done some too. They've all come up with this somewhere between 1.5 and say 4.5, 5% infection rate among general population. That's what they've projected based on their results of rather broad surveys that they've done. It has to be limited so far because the resources are still limited. But if the studies are well conducted, you can get good information. Yeah, but we do need to have the freedom to figure out whether to buy these tests for ourselves. There are people who have been showing me there's different places where maybe I could go get antibody tested, and I'm very curious to go do this, and I might go do it depending on when the price and the accuracy looks like something that it's within my value hierarchy. I'm of course curious. If you already discovered that you have the antibodies, then there's a little bit less worry, a little bit less precaution than you're going to take out there. You still don't know whether you can be reinfected, but there's a good chance that you won't be. And at least you're not so terrified, like, oh gosh, I haven't had it yet. You can have sort of the equanimity of knowing, hey, I've been exposed to it and I haven't been that sick yet. That would just be wonderful. Because then, of course, if you were exposed to another strain, chances are that your body would handle it quite well. So yeah, it could be worth it. It could not. But going back to where we were with this, again, I'm looking at that first false alternative, the concern with the virus itself and being in favor of some sort of lockdown or restraints in behavior versus being concerned about the economy at large. You can be in favor of, in today's context, a very limited sort of lockdown where government keeps up its part of the bargain. It does the mea culpa, it gets out of the way. It doesn't try to make itself so important and come in there and pretend that it's a productive entity that can solve problems. It's people who solve problems. It's government that's supposed to sit there and just protect our rights and have a very limited emergency role when you have any sort of a disaster or and again, it's keeping order in the face of a disaster is all you're looking at. And again, or times of war when there's a real war. Speaking of war, by the way, and I haven't looked at too much of this story yet, but I've seen two different headlines on it now. And Trump is on Sunday, he's saying, he's not happy with China. He doesn't want to say too much yet, but I've seen stories about we've got ships off of China. And then I heard this warning that Australia is joining in off of China as well. China has done something bad here. Okay. Chances are the virus research that they've done in the lab is in some way responsible. I mean, we could say this is another false alternative. If you suspect an involvement, some sort of mishandling on that part of the China lab, does that mean that you think that in the lab that they were purposefully engineering a bioweapon or something? Are you a conspiracy theorist, right? So either you reject conspiracy theory or you embrace the idea that China was, in that lab somehow responsible for what has happened. My hunch, based on everything that I've seen so far out there, is that there was some irresponsibility on the part of the lab in Wuhan. It didn't amount to trying to design a bioweapon. We've got to see, the last piece of the sort of more conspiracy theory minded side of this that I saw yesterday on Twitter going around. It's a rumor. I don't know if it's true yet. We're going to see if WikiLeaks publishes and stuff, but that there's been hacking into emails of the Gates Foundation, the World Health Organization, and the Wuhan lab. And supposedly people are saying that it shows that there's the HIV component, inserted into this, respiratory virus that is the coronavirus. And to see an HIV component in there, it means only that it could be genetic engineering, blah, 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 right? That's the theory. That's the full-on conspiracy theory that's out there, that they're engineering this as a bioweapon, blah, blah, blah. No, you can believe that China played a role at the very least in the cover-up, But the sense that I'm getting is they were at the very least doing some sort of viral research, potentially, probably with the purpose of showing that they were first in the world in combating the virus, and they came up with vaccines first and blah, blah, blah. They want to be the best and the first. And something went wrong and they covered it up. That's my sense of it. If even it wasn't that, but that they just did the cover up, we know they did the cover up. You can hold them responsible for doing this cover up and thereby unleashing this virus all over the world and causing death and destruction. So we might have an actual war, right? And does it amount to war when China covers it up, knowing full well that a likelihood is going to be that this is going to be a pandemic with lots of death and destruction? Is that an active war on the part of China? We could have that whole discussion. Maybe that's something I could talk about with Yaron on Sunday. I've told some of you guys, I don't know if I've told all of you guys, I'm going to be back with Yaron on Sunday. On Sunday, we're going to have Yaron and Amy show. Maybe he and I are going to be having this debate about being in favor of a lockdown for a limited time today, which I'm arguing for here today, versus what I've heard amongst many objectivists. I'm not exactly sure exactly where he stands on this. I know that many are opposed entirely to being in favor of any sort of lockdown, even today, even in today's mixed economy. But, anyway, that'll be a fun discussion. Are we going to be at war? Are we not going to be at war? Bree says China is embarrassed by their people's barbaric food preferences. And yes, it was uncovered by anonymous. So my, tendency would be to believe the eyewitness reports that were in one of these papers that was circulated around. The eyewitness reports were saying that bats were not sold at that wet market in Wuhan that was supposedly the origin of the virus. The wet market was 280 meters away from the lab. And I could easily see that somebody, through a mishap in the lab, someone who worked there was infected and also went to the wet market to buy things for lunch or something and then spread it. I could see that so easily. So I don't think it was necessarily the barbaric food preferences, although I've heard some discussions about that, and the wet markets are not the most sanitary places, et cetera, and that would make it even easier for a virus to be spread. But I think that you'd have to have probably quite a bit of interface between the bat and the human to catch those viruses. And, as I said, also, I've heard through these eyewitness testimonies that that area of China is not one in which they routinely consume this sort of bat for food. Apropos of our government not upholding its side of the bargain, Mark in the chat room over at YouTube says that the closing immigration stuff is scary. Yeah, the closing immigration stuff is scary, right? Because if you're opening America for business again, as Trump likes to say, you are opening it, right? And part of business in America is having the ability to hire people from overseas, to bring in potential lessees and other things from overseas. And so, this now we are really in a global economy. I know that Trump wants to say, oh, see, I was right. We shouldn't have supply chains overseas because that's how we get the virus, the plague, the invisible enemy, as he calls it. He's been using this to push his pet issues of trade and immigration just as much as a Gavin Newsom has been using it to push his income inequality agenda, and Cuomo has been using it to push all his things. And the politicians have been closing down various parks and beaches and everything else. They have just been so overzealous and irrational, because you can go to beaches and parks and maintain your 6-foot distance and do all of these things. And yes, we are all supposed to be out enjoying the fresh air and sunshine to boost our immunity during this time. If they actually cared about the end game, which is to not overload the hospitals, then you would say, okay, we're going to ban these type of gatherings, but we're not going to go overboard with it. Anyway, so that's all on the first false alternative, right? Concern with the virus and being in favor of some sort of limited lockdown in order to mitigate the pernicious effects of the virus again in today's system, and also the virus as we knew it when we started this, which appeared maybe to be more potential emergency than it does now. Be in favor of that limited lockdown versus, does that mean you are not concerned at all about the financial ramifications going forward? No. Again, very limited, tailored to whatever it is to get the hell out of this. And also with a lot of mea culpas, a lot of lessons learned that will hopefully free things up and make things better economically in the future. That is not what we're seeing. We are seeing this morning, Mnuchin and Trump and stuff, they're talking about even a fourth phase of the either PPE or infrastructure or, other so-called government investments, which basically means printing money, impoverishing more people in the long term in the name of fighting the invisible enemy and the plague and all these other things. That's what we're seeing. Interesting. So Bree says 60% of illness, including all seasonal flu, comes from zoonotic animals, not from scary China labs. Okay, well, I don't know that myself. Mm. Very low mortality rates is what they're saying with the antibodies versus reported cases. Yeah, we're still learning that now. But as I said, Josh, as far as we know, this is a turbocharged flu. And going forward, we really should be opening things up. But I actually do think that there are justifications for some restrictions going forward, like big events and things like that, where people are going to be reckless vectors for the disease, and you don't have hospitals and doctors and nurses being able to take legal measures to protect themselves because they are under mandates in today's economy. We do not have the free market that is able to let each person protect himself as he sees fit today, particularly our healthcare workers. And so, no, we can't just do the thing that would be the right thing to do in an ideal society, even with just a turbocharged flu. We can't. So that's my first false alternative. Another false alternative that we want to talk about is defying authority versus being sensible about the virus and preventing spread. So what's the good news about people out there willingly and wonderfully defying authority? If you are out there on the media and watching, maybe you don't want to be on social media and look at all the news all the time. Like I said, yesterday I was in a big funk and I got in a low mood, both about the economic consequences going forward and about the prospect of the fact that this virus is going to be a reality for us for the next year or so, but while they come up with a vaccine at least. Out there in the news, there was a piece of fun, amusing news, which was that de Blasio had put out there a call on Twitter, has this little meme graphic and everything. And he says, if you want to report citizens, I'm calling on you to report your fellow citizens who are not practicing proper social distancing measures. And he says, just text a photo of, these people not practicing the proper measures to such and such number, and we'll get on it. We're going to go enforce the social distancing measures. And I actually think that even if you are going to have mandated social distancing measures of a certain kind during this time, which is probably, again, in today's world, justified right now, to do some of this, I would not call on citizens to report. This is something that is so anti-American, right? Americans do not say, oh, comrade, you're not doing this and you're not doing that. And sure enough, what did you see happen in reaction to de Blasio? That text number, whatever it was bombarded with penis pictures on the one hand, bunch of unsolicited pictures, and also pictures of Hitler, which, because again, this is a very fascist measure and everybody is going to report to the Fuhrer and, report their fellow citizens as being out of line, etc. There was a number of those cases in Nazi Germany where, even like a wife would report a husband or something for speaking ill of the regime, and then the husband would be sent out on the front lines. I mean, just hideous, horrible stories, right? So what is de Blasio asking us to do? Report your fellow citizen. That is too far in this era. Again, the whole lockdown thing is supposed to be a very limited time measure. It should never get to the point where people are going stir crazy and wanting to go out there and do things that are irrational and violating it anyway. Our politicians have not upheld their end of the bargain. They have gone for draconian measures. They have dropped the ball when maybe they should have acted sooner. De Blasio is huge on that, right? New York, particularly physically in terms of the conditions of living there and the taking public transportation, he should have known, right? And you can't make up for it later by saying, okay, well, now we're going to have extreme social distancing measures and total lockdown for weeks and weeks and weeks on end, and also make people report their fellow citizens. It's ridiculous, right? So love to see this, love to see the defiance. Now, when I was cheering it out on Twitter, then I have these people come back and say, oh, well, you must be in favor of people going out there and being reckless and spread the disease. And no, this is a false alternative, right? And I surely hope that people do not embrace this false alternative going forward, that if they want to defy overbearing authority and they want to get out there and live their lives, that they're going to do it in such a way that they are going to act reckless and, not even worry about whether they're spreading this virus to people. That is uncalled for. And again, I'm telling you now, if you didn't already know before, there are people who are not able to protect themselves from your reckless actions, namely our frontline healthcare workers, do not have a choice. The government is forcing them to treat whoever walks into the door of the hospital based on your reckless action. So that's ridiculous. So don't do this. Do not embrace this false alternative. Now that everything's opening up, which it should open up, it is actually on you to go out there and be a reasonable, conscientious person who shows some empathy for the people, the healthcare workers who are on the front lines, who are being exposed to tremendous viral and potentially psychological loads. We may see spikes in cases as things are opened up more. Do your best to prevent those spikes while going out there and being productive and living your lives. It is time. I mean, I talked about this last Friday on the show with James, whereas I was in favor of a limited lockdown. You could see that after a certain point, it is rougher, it is more dangerous to continue a lockdown than it is to deal with the virus. But all of this takes into account that people are going to go out there and be reasonable about it. Josh says he's looking forward to finally having the lockdown idea challenged by your own. Okay. I mean, I'm looking forward to it too. That's fine. Smackdown, right? Let's go. It's so ridiculous that people are getting so nasty during this time period about this. Again, I don't know if you were here during the beginning of the show, Josh, but I explained entirely the context for this, which is that we are in a mixed economy situation such that your ideal scenario, the absolutely no lockdown scenario, cannot happen without disaster. And I will argue with anybody. I will argue with Leonard Peikoff about this. I will argue with anybody about this. And sorry, I'm not in favor of getting rid of Social Security tomorrow. Josh, when we were talking about your measure to go before the New Hampshire legislature, right? This privacy protecting by getting rid of the third party doctrine, I pointed out to you the various ways that we cannot be entirely consistent with this today because there are so many regulations that involve sharing information without a warrant, right? And, obviously that's kind of my pet issue. And so I'm sensitive to that. But then I understood that, yeah, you can only promote realistic measures today. Similarly with lockdown. It's the same issue. We are not in that scenario. You cannot ignore today's context. At the same time, I don't expect our politicians to just say, okay, well, we're going to do this forever. I want them to learn lessons from this. So, yeah. Governors closing all access to various places and stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, they have been irrational about this. They have not upheld their part of the bargain. And so, as I said, now it is time to end these lockdowns, and let's hope that it is done as quickly as possible. I mean, indefinite lockdowns and the governors making themselves all important and keeping control forever is not a good way. And then I do hope that when they lift the restrictions, people aren't so fed up with it that they don't behave irrationally going forward. What's my take on Sweden's policy? As I understand, Sweden's policy has been to not have any lockdowns at all, but then there are certain restrictions. It could work depending on a certain culture of already existing social distancing. And as I understand it, there's probably a mix of measures there. So there's not a total lockdown, but there's a number of social distancing measures that have been advised and or required, and that people are complying with them. And so that there's a good chance of success. It could work in some places. Again, I'm not saying for sure a lockdown would have to take place. I'm saying that there probably was at a certain point, depending on certain places and the geography, a justification for lockdowns, certainly in a place like New York, right, where you've got the crammed together people. Nebraska or something, no way, right? Um, and I don't know how it is in Sweden. As I understand, culturally in Sweden, there's a lot more ability to maintain social distance normally, maybe a little more reserved or something. But I don't know if that's really true or if that's just a generalization that I've heard. I wish them the best. And it would be really cool for us to, at the end of this, see how different societies have handled the challenge and what the ultimate results were. They also had laws and policy in place on how to manage a pandemic. Well, yeah, so that might help as well. We know that they aren't 100% free of restrictions, but maybe they were relatively free of restrictions during this period. And what made that possible? And can we learn lessons? And think about, let's keep working towards that ideal society where we potentially would only have to have a lockdown in a case like an Ebola. And it would only have to be for a limited period of time where we isolate and trace all those cases and boom, we're done, right? So it would be really nice. I think it would be the best scenario to not have a lockdown, of course. But I don't know that that was a realistic option for us given all the circumstances. So that is that. So so can define authority versus being sensible to prevent the spread of the virus. I see that as a false alternative. And in the spirit of defying authority, why don't we go ahead and I'm going to try to share a bit of my screen here. I'm going to the coronavirus task force, and I'm just going to play with this toy a little bit if I can and see how I do. Let me play this. He's introducing Munchen now. Yeah. All the thank yous, right? All the name dropping you could see as sort of like an appeal to authority, right? All these important people have been working with us, so therefore you should be in favor of whatever we're working on. Is it not working? Let me see if I just made a mistake with you guys. I'm going to come back over to the chat. It wasn't working. You can't see. Were you able to hear? Were you able to hear? Now, yes. Okay. Only now can you do it. Okay. So see, I've got to learn how to use these toys better. Let me get back over to it and we'll play with it a little bit again. I'm going to back up. Okay. Okay. So in the beginning, he's doing all these thank yous, like I said. Yeah, so we've had tremendous support. This is all appeal to authority stuff. If we've had tremendous support, you're supposed to be geared up to be excited about it and accept it. Let me say one thing about all this, right? So Trump is just taking this and running with the excuse of this emergency to fund all sorts of stuff. Now, again, when we've got this huge mixed economy and you overlay on this huge mixed economy, this disaster of a virus that potentially was worse than we're now learning it is, right? And you're going to lock down for a couple weeks, 3 weeks. You could see also a limited role for government coming in and reimbursing those people who have been asked to stay home and then they have no way of getting any money during that time. You could see that again justified as a limited measure, but again, it's got to be accompanied with a mea culpa and it's got to be very narrowly tailored and all this kind of stuff. You know, I want to be on the premise that my leaders are going to learn something from this and move towards a freer economy that's more agile and able to respond to this in the next time it comes around without government assistance to a large degree, unless it's like Ebola or something, you need government there. But here, you know, what are they doing? They're giving 50 billion to this and this to that and that to that. They're going too far. And I think we are going to see a lot of financial fallout from it. And all we can do, like I said yesterday, I was depressed about it. I'm hoping it's not going to be too bad. So he's going to keep listing the amount of money. Here we go. Now they have to give money to hospitals. They, you know, giving money and testing. Why? Because we still have the mandate on the damn hospitals. The hospitals have to treat everybody who walks in, whether they're insured or not, how hopeless it is, how reckless they were, whatever it is. Hospitals are under mandates to treat. Broad participation, that is what we call in my logic class an appeal to authority, quantitative, you know, the 50 million Frenchmen type. If there's broad participation, boy, it's got to be a great program. This is the oops portion of the presentation. Like, oops, we didn't, you know, restrict it enough so that these big businesses couldn't take the loans, and now they're giving it back. Now, the premise is that all the big businesses don't need money when they're shut down during this time, but, you know, obviously this is an imperfect thing. So, you know, the favoring of small business over big business is, of course, a real fallacy, right? That somehow small business is more deserving than big business. It's the big businesses that are actually doing a lot of good right now, too. Trump is going to make them do it. Harvard got money under this program. That is ridiculous, right? He's only going to mention Harvard. I'm fine with bashing Harvard right now because they're going to have a anti-homeschooling conference coming up. Give them the benefit of the doubt when they've been gaming the system. I mean, this is the danger of anything like this. Again, it is not perfect. You know, could you see a limited role for giving unemployment benefits and other things during this time to people? Yes, because you are forcing them to stay home, which is not an ideal scenario at all. Reimburse, yes, but try to make it in some way that it can't be gamed the way it is. This is hugely embarrassing. Harvard comes in and gets this loan, and you know, Harvard's so well endowed. Okay, so he is actually deflecting there, right? He's missing the point of the question. How are you going to make sure that they get it this time? And he's saying, well, look, all these other people got it last time. And he's throwing a bunch of statistics out there to present, just to distract you from the fact that there is no guarantee, of course, that it's going to get where it's supposed to go. Okay. So again, they're concerned about the fact that it's just going to be snapped up and not get to the people because there's not a quality control on who's actually getting this money, right? It's just going to be snapped up and gone, and the people who deserve it aren't going to get it. That's the concern. And what does he do? He deflects, right? He says, oh, well, it's this, we've never done this before. We've given out more money than the whole time of the SBA program. Is that actually relevant to the answer of the question? Not at all. He is completely missing the point, deliberately missing the point. And the reason that I wanted to play this clip for you is because this guy is more of a pro in using logical fallacies during a briefing like this to, try to gain favor for their measures, and at the same time deflect questions that show weaknesses in his position. He is more of a pro than Trump is, which is why I wanted to show you this. Now, was that a complete deflection? Maybe that one was not a complete deflection. He's concerned about the fact that people with minor criminal convictions, probably drug-related convictions, can't get the money from this program, and that it's really not fair. Say if you had a charge on marijuana or something. And apparently they've kept significant restrictions, but he's saying, oh, it's less than it was. And so you're supposed to be satisfied with that. Now, did you see this? Okay, so she's saying, she's saying that we're concerned about all this government spending, right? Imagine that you're concerned about government spending, and they're talking about phase 4 and everything. So the first thing he does is, I've got the president's support on phase 4. So he's appealing to the authority of the president, first of all. He's been talking about infrastructure since the campaign. So therefore, you shouldn't object to spending money on it because he's been talking about it, right? Okay, now, all of these things, he's just listing off all these things that are important. All of these things are important. Therefore, you shouldn't be concerned about government spending money on it. Obviously, that's a false alternative. If something's important, it doesn't mean that government has to spend money on it. Another alternative is that private concerns can go ahead and invest in that. Broadband particularly concerns me right now because one thing that I've talked about on my shows is the so-called Earn It Act. And with the Earn It Act, they are trying to pass this piece of legislation that's going to protect against child pornography. And what they end up doing is they end up instituting a framework in which a committee of 19 or whoever people can ban encryption, ban end-to-end encryption. That is tremendously dangerous. So another concern of mine is they're going to sneak in this infrastructure bill and everybody under the threat of the invisible enemy plague, whatever he's calling it this week, they're, all the legislators are going to pass this, rush it through. And tucked in this infrastructure bill about broadband is going to be tremendous government control over broadband, and how that you're not going to be able to send end-to-end encryption over the broadband or something bizarre like that. Like, your Apple cannot, have its customers have access to broadband facilities anymore unless they agree to a backdoor to their encryption or something. This is the sort of thing I fear that they're doing. So again, our politicians are not playing their part. We need to keep the feet to the fire here. Okay, so the fiscal issues of the states, we've heard from the governors, they're trying to maybe buy some loyalty from the governors too. And he's got various euphemisms you hear through there. He talks about incentives to certain types of businesses. No, he means subsidizing, right? So there's euphemisms that they're using now. Again, the question was about the spending. Can we afford this, et cetera? And he completely deflects. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and draw a line here and not do much more of this today, but I am happy to have tried this toy with you a little bit, and I hope that that is something that has worked for you. So yeah, oh, you do see me up in the corner when I'm doing this as well. Okay, that's interesting that you guys also see me a little bit. Okay. Yeah, this is a fun toy. So we're going to play with this toy more going forward. Before I let you guys go for today, I want to talk about one more false alternative. And it's something that came up in my logic class. Yeah, I've got my little calendar here and I've written my notes in my little calendar. So reason versus emotion came up in my logic class is really, I think, a dichotomy that some people are dealing with during this era. And it came up in this way for one of my students. We were covering the appeal to pity, what's called in Latin argumentum ad misericordiam, the appeal to pity. And the student asked, well, am I making myself susceptible to the appeal to pity because I really wasn't taking the danger of coronavirus very seriously? And then one of my friends came down with it. And then now sort of my thinking has shifted in a certain way. And am I, sort of appealing to my own emotion, or am I being swayed by the pity or whatever it is, right? I'm using emotion as a tool of cognition now. And I think, no, that is actually really, there's a false alternative that you could fall into here. We are again in this era where you've got this emergency situation, at least potential emergency situation, depending on your circumstances. And of course, the context of knowledge. And we're in this mixed economy where, all this tranches of money that Mnuchin and them could create a financial disaster or not. We don't know, right? So there's so much unknown, there's danger and everything. And we are all as individuals trying to figure out, well, what do we advocate for? What do we do in our own lives to deal with all this? And how do we take our hierarchy of values and sort of figure out how to act in accordance with our hierarchy of values during this time? And what I think happens to some people, if that situation happens and suddenly somebody that they know is affected by coronavirus, then it's not that their thinking has totally changed, but perhaps the values in their hierarchy are becoming more real to them. There is a danger of getting sort of very rationalistic and kind of beating the same drum, or falling on your axe to grind, or whatever your pet peeve is, or all different ways of putting the same thing, that you sort of take your framework for thinking and just impose it on the current era. And you might not be aware of how all of your values and your hierarchy of values are actually being affected. Your emotions can make you aware of that. Now, you can't just run with your emotion, but it might be that your emotion makes you go through another weighing. And I think, given the new knowledge that comes across our desktops, or whatever, our devices, and everything that we're exposed to every day, the new pieces of information, what we learn about how our values are being affected, everything, there's a constant rejiggering of this. And the fact that a certain emotion that you experience is a prompting to you to sort of reshuffle and figure out what is the best thing going forward, as long as you're actually doing that rationally, no, you're not being swayed by emotion. So it's not reason versus emotion. Emotions can be very valuable tools to make you think about certain things, but then you're going to still think about them rationally, and then go forward and keep figuring out on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes make your best plan that you can and adjust it according to the circumstances. So anyway, I hope that was helpful. Thank you for oh, you couldn't hear the speaker on the video. You were not able to hear the speaker on the video. Is that true? That whole time I'm sitting there and I'm showing you that and you couldn't hear him? Okay, if you can't, I'll have to play with this toy more. Anyway, I do have to go pretty quick here. So I'm going to end the show now, but if it's really true, oh, good thing for subtitles. So you couldn't hear the audio. Okay, I'm going to have to talk to Tamir again, because Tamir was able to use Zoom to share both the video and the audio. Okay, I'm going to do it next time. I will do it. I'm glad I didn't go on longer with that this time. Sorry, guys, mea culpa. I'll be more perfect next time. And Friday, I'm going to be on here with James Valiant, same time. Maybe we'll try the toy again a little bit then. That could be fun to do it with James. I'll get it up to speed. I promise I will do it. And we will talk then, okay? I'll see you guys next week. I wish you guys all the best of health and safety out there. Take care, okay?